Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. I'm going to talk about something that happened to me in Tennessee around 3 years ago, and it still makes me shiver to think about it. I'd just retired from my 32-year career as a lineman for the electric company. At the age of 58, I purchased a small cabin close to Rowan Mountain. I believed I had earned after years of climbing poles, repairing power lines, and dealing with all types of weather. Some quiet is much needed. It was the ideal location, 2 acres or so of woodland land. Maybe half a mile down the steep road is the closest neighbor. Only me. Additionally, a few months after moving up there, I rescued my German Shepherd mix, Buster, from the pound. The cabin contained everything I needed, but it wasn't particularly nice. A good kitchen, a wood stove, and a wraparound porch, where I could enjoy my morning coffee while seeing the mists flowing through the trees. Life was easy, just the way I wanted it to be. It all began on a Tuesday night in late October, following decades of enduring power outages and round-the-clock emergency calls. Even after nightfall, the temperature was unusually high for the season, perhaps in the mid-60s. I had just gotten comfortable in my recliner with a beer after spending the day chopping firewood, when Buster began acting strangely on the nightly news. As usual, he was lying by the front door, but all of a sudden, his ears straightened and his head flew up. After that, he began to growl softly, not combative, but more as if he had something to tell me. I listened while the TV was muted, but all I could hear were the typical sounds of the mountains. Perhaps an owl can be seen in the distance as you wind through the pines. But Buster continued to stare at the entrance, his entire body tensed as if he were about to run. Perhaps it was just a raccoon or something getting into the trash cans, I thought. In order to view out the window, I turned on the porch light. There was nothing but the tree line beyond and the deserted yard. However, Buster refused to calm down and continued to pace between the door and me, while muttering softly. I heard it at midnight, not the rustling of leaves or the haphazard breaking of branches, but footsteps. I took deliberate, measured steps. Outside the window of my bedroom, Buster had been restless all evening, getting up and resting down every few minutes, so I was already half asleep. It sounded faint, but clear, like someone attempting but failing to stroll silently. Pause, crunch, pause, crunch. I lay there listening as I cautiously and slowly made my way around the cabin's side, trying to tell myself it was only a bear or a deer, but the rhythm seemed off to steady, to deliberate. Now Buster stood at the foot of my bed, peering out the window with his fur sticking up down his spine. I could make out his outline in my alarm clock's faint light. All the muscles in his body tensed. The footsteps circled from the bedroom window toward the back of the cabin for about 2 minutes before abruptly ceasing. Total quiet, but for Buster's gentle panting and my own breathing. Before I worked, I waited for roughly 20 minutes, mustered the courage to leave the bed and look out the windows. First snuck to the bedroom window, staying low, and peered out through the corner of the blinds after grabbing my old mag light off the nightstand. If something larger than a cat passed by, the motion sensor light I had put him back there ought to have turned on, but it was dark. I made my way through checked every window in the cabin, room by room, but found nothing out of the ordinary. There was no movement, the tree iron was motionless, and the yard appeared normal. However, I spotted something that made my chest tighten as I approached the kitchen window that views the back of the property. The tall grass at the back edge of my property line had a definite path pushed into it, as if someone had been walking back and forth along it several times. About 30 yards out, The grass was crooked in a line that was perhaps 2 feet broad and ran parallel to the cottage. After nearly 2 years of living there, I had never witnessed anything like that. It wasn't there, and the path was too straight and purposeful to be animal-derived. When I had been working on the woodpile back earlier that day, I went outside the following morning to take a better look at that grassy path. It was even clearer in the daylight. There was an old track that was perhaps 100 yards long and ran the whole back boundary of my property. It wasn't just twisted grass. In fact, it was somewhat worn down, as if someone had been using this path frequently for a long time. The discovery of a few cigarette butts along the trail really got to me. Not the hand-rolled ones, but the ones with filters, as one might anticipate from an elderly person living off the grid. These were also brand new, perhaps only a day or 2 old. In a muddy area close to the property's corner, I also discovered what appeared to be heel prints. They appear to be work boots in sizes 10 or 11. After snapping a few photos with my phone, I walked around my property's perimeter for the remainder of the morning, searching for anything else that might be amiss. Discovered what seemed to be a boot print at the mailbox and a few additional cigarette butts close to the property's front perimeter. It seemed as though someone had been observing the cabin, getting to know my habits, and possibly making plans. I kept a baseball bat by my bed that night and made sure all the windows and doors were securely fastened. During the day, Buster appeared more at ease, but as soon as the sun set, he resumed his restless behavior from the previous evening. I heard them again about 11 o'clock, those careful steps, from the front of the cabin this time. I went to the living room window after grabbing the bat and my flashlight. Now, the footsteps were louder and more assured, as if the person behind them didn't care as much about being silent. I could listen as they traversed a gravel driveway and entered the front porch's wooden steps. Slowly and deliberately, as if someone were testing every step, the porch boards creaked under the weight. With his lips pushed back in a wordless growl, Buster was practically vibrating with stress. I held my breath. He heard the footsteps cross the porch, stop for what seemed like an eternity at the front door, then walk around toward the cabin side. The motion lights weren't triggering when they should have. I recognized then that whoever this was had most likely disabled them in some way. I had enough, I determined. Took hold of my .38 chambered and taken from the gun safe. After that, they opened the front door and went outside onto the porch. With only a small portion of the moon providing enough light to make out the tree outlines, the night air was calm and cold. I listened intently, but now I could hear nothing, no rustling, no footsteps. My voice reverberated off the trees and seemed to linger in the air for a while as I yelled, "I know you're out there. This is private property, and you need to leave right now." No answer. For perhaps 10 minutes, I stood there listening intently and looking around in the dark, but it seemed as though whoever had been there had simply disappeared. Even frightening than the footsteps had been the quiet. I returned inside and sat in my chair with the rifle in my lap for the remainder of the night, occasionally falling asleep, but never truly falling asleep. Buster, who had never done this before, cuddled up directly behind my chair and continued to raise his head every few minutes to gaze out at the windows. I discovered the actual proof that made all the difference the following morning. To be honest, I had been putting off looking at the back of the cabin because I was afraid of what I would discover. However, the sunlight gave me the confidence to explore the entire perimeter in search of hints about what had been going on. My knees became weak when I arrived at the furthest rear corner, where the cabin is closest to the tree line. Two trees were connected by wires that were precisely ankle high, perhaps 6 inches above the ground, not just 1 or 2, but 4 distinct wire traps, spaced about 20 feet apart, are well positioned to capture a person strolling from the cabin toward the woods, with just enough slack to trip someone, but not enough to be noticeable unless you were looking for them. The wires were tightly wound around the branches. These were no haphazard hunting traps. They were placed especially to intercept a person approaching from my rear entrance. The jagged and sharp ends of the twisted metal were made to entangle and injure your legs. I would have fallen hard and most likely been severely injured if I had gone out there in the dark as I had intended to do. As I stood there, I stared at those wires for a while, trying to take in what I was seeing. This was more than a skulking individual on my land. This was done on purpose, with the intention of hurting me. The placement was too accurate to be coincidental. If I came out the back door to investigate weird noises, the person who placed these traps knew exactly where I would be most likely to walk. They had most likely seen me enough to be familiar with my routine, perhaps even accompanying me on my evening walks with Buster. I felt nauseous at the idea that someone had been researching me and organizing this entire situation. I meticulously photographed every wire trap from various perspectives before removing them all with my wire cutters. The metal was new, having likely been installed in the previous day or two. I was cutting the last one when I saw something else that added to the unsettling nature of the situation. Footprints were found in the soft soil nearby. The trees were tiny, though. Not the larger prints I'd discovered by the mailbox, but perhaps a size 7 or 8 boot. Either two people were involved, or someone was trying to mislead me on purpose. I drove directly to the town sheriff's office that afternoon and submitted a report. I could tell Deputy Johnson was struggling to take my account seriously, even after he listened to it and looked at the pictures on my phone. He persisted in inquiring about my adversaries, any arguments I may have had with neighbors, and whether I might have been intoxicated when I heard the footfall. His perspective drastically shifted once I showed him the images of the wire traps. In his 20 years as a police officer, he claimed to have never witnessed anything like it. Furthermore, that degree of forethought typically indicated that someone was preparing something far more serious than simple harassment. I could tell he believed this was likely to be a one-time incident, but he did promise to have a police car stop by my house a couple of times during the next week and to contact right away if I saw or heard anything else, perhaps some children. Pulling a practical joke or a resentful person who needed to vent, he was unaware of his error. I went to the hardware shop for the remainder of the day to purchase motion-activated cameras, improve locks, and a floodlight system that would illuminate my property's whole perimeter. I wanted to be prepared for whoever was going to return. I hardly slept for more than a few hours at a time over the entire following week. I installed my new security system. Every facet of the cabin was covered by the cameras, and if anything, larger than a squirrel walked outside. The floodlights would make the entire area bright as day. There was silence for 3 nights. No odd behavior from Buster. No footsteps. Nothing. I began to suspect that the person had either moved on or had been intimidated by my confrontation that evening. But around 2 a.m. on the 4th night, all of the floodlights around my cabin suddenly came to life. Anticipating someone caught in the lights, I snatched up my rifle and hurried to the window. Rather, I noticed something that made me understand how bad things had gotten. All of the cameras that I had set up had been destroyed. It was entirely broken with what appeared to be a sledgehammer, not merely disconnected or knocked down. Additionally, the light's motion sensors had been turned off, but not until catching the offender on the one camera they had overlooked. I had concealed a trail camera in a tree some 50 yards away. The following morning, when I watched the video, I witnessed a person wearing black clothes and a ski mask methodically and precisely disabling my security system, as if they had been watching me build everything all week. They were completely aware of where everything was placed. The thing that truly frightened me, though, is this. The figure waved at the camera in the last few seconds of the video before it was also destroyed. I informed Deputy Johnson over the phone that same morning that I was packed up and heading out. He made an effort to get me to stay. I had had enough, but they said they would step up patrols and possibly start a surveillance operation. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened because, whoever it was, this had gone from harassing to property destruction. While I decided what to do with the cottage, I spent 2 days packing up my belongings and making plans to rent a place in town. I waited on the porch with Buster and my 38 on my last night there, hoping they might make an appearance one last time. I thought I heard them at midnight, the same slow steps, but this time they approached the porch's edge directly. In the darkness, I could feel people standing and observing, about 10 feet away. Even though I couldn't see them, I shouted that they had won and could take the place, and that I was going to leave and wouldn't be returning. I never heard the footsteps again as they gradually faded away. 6 months later, I sold the cottage to an Atlanta family who converted it into a holiday rental. To the best of my knowledge, they have never experienced any issues. However, I occasionally ponder whether the person who stalked me is still out there in those mountains, waiting for the ideal victim to appear. Music. That summer, we were staying near the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina. This small lodge had been hired by my parents for a week. There was hardly any coverage and no Wi-Fi, but there were trees and paths all around, which my dad kept referring to as refreshing. I'd brought my sketchbook, earplugs, and a backup battery, but I wasn't excited about being taken away from my pals for a family outing on my 16th birthday. I assumed I could withstand a few days of insect bites and trail mix. We had left early that morning for a well-known viewpoint hike. It was gorgeous despite the fog. Everything seems a little magical because of the gentle bluish mist that hangs low between the trees. The actual track was clearly defined and simple to navigate. However, I had taken a few breaks to sketch and take pictures of some tree roots that appeared to be holding onto the ground like hands. I eventually became aware that I was no longer able to hear my parents' voices. I assumed they would simply continue to walk and I would catch up. Without hesitation, I proceeded to the next bend in the route. However, they weren't at the turn. It split open into something I had never seen before. One trail had a small incline, the other continued to climb. I didn't make any noise. I assumed I would meet them at the top, so I went the uphill path. However, the fog increased and the trees grew thicker after 10 minutes. I could only hear the crunch of my own footsteps, now, not the sound of birds. I was trying not to freak out, but my chest was constricted, and I kept looking over my shoulder as if I thought I might see something that wasn't there. The voice was quiet and close when I heard someone say, "Hey, are you lost?" Standing a few feet off the route was a boy of my age, dressed in cargo shorts and a faded red hoodie. His hair was rather disheveled and light brown, and when he turned, a tiny scar on his chin caught the light. There was something strangely familiar about him, like a face from a half-remembered dream. He grinned as if it didn't matter when I explained that I was attempting to return to the parking lot. "I am aware of the path. It's simple. Come on." He turned and began to walk without waiting. He moved with such ease and confidence that I followed him despite my little hesitation. He hardly spoke, only occasionally looked back to make sure I was still behind him. As we went, the woods felt less dense and the fog appeared to clear slightly. When I asked him his name and attempted to strike up a discussion, he just replied, "Eli." When I asked him if he frequently went, he simply replied, "I used to." I assumed that he lived close by or had relatives who frequently traveled to the area. He sounded as though he didn't speak quickly because of the steady, gentle rhythm of his voice. The strange thing was that I didn't recognize the track he took me on. This loop felt older and quieter than the others, although I believed I remembered most of them from the chart we had studied at the ranger station. Here, the trees were taller, and I saw carved initials and dates that had faded with age in one of them. "That one's mine," Eli said, touching one as we went by. He simply shrugged, as if it didn't matter when I inquired what he meant. We went past a fallen stone wall that was partially engulfed by plants and over a wooden footbridge that squeaked beneath our feet. Earlier, none of this had been on the trail. Nevertheless, the parking lot appeared front of me after around 20 minutes through the woods. You could just make out the line of cars. I felt a wave of relief. He was already moving back toward the woods when I turned to thank him. He said, "You'll be fine now," waved briefly, and turned around. I didn't ask him whether he wanted to accompany me or if he needed a ride. He was only a blur between the trees as I watched him walk. When I arrived at the lot, I saw my dad close by our vehicle, desperately looking toward the trailhead. He gave off the impression that he was going to yell before giving me one of those close, silent embraces. Immediately after, my mother rushed over and said they had been searching everywhere and were going to call for assistance. I informed them that I had been lost, but that I had been rescued by a man named Eli. I simply replied that he was a young man about my age when they inquired as to whether he was a ranger or another hiker. My father asked him where he was, squinting toward the woods. I gestured back, but Eli was obviously no longer there. The trail behind me seems deserted. My parents demanded that we stop at the ranger station to inform someone that I had been turned around. They were concerned that the trail arrangement would be flawed or that there might be missing signage. I strolled over to a faded bulletin board that was covered with old laminated notices and trail maps as my dad spoke to the older ranger behind the desk. A few pictures of persons who passed away in the park were included in a section named in memory until one of the names struck me like a blow to the chest. I wasn't really listening. Chambers, Eli. Although his picture was perhaps 10 years old, the face remained its obvious. Same chin scar, same light brown hair. He slipped and fell during a hike close to one of the overlooks. According to the caption below, it was 2011. I looked at it for what seemed like an eternity. My parents dismissed it as a coincidence when I told them. They claimed that, given all the tension, I most likely heard the name from the board and filled in the rest in my head. However, I had never seen that picture before. Up until that point, I had never even gotten close to the board. The ranger must have heard what I was saying, because he approached me in silence and inquired about the trail I had been on. I told him, and his expression altered. It was neither theatrical nor dramatic. He simply turned pale in a faint, worn-out manner, as if someone who hoped they would never hear it again after hearing it. He inquired about the boy's appearance, and, almost as if he had anticipated it, he nodded slowly when I recounted Eli. "You're not the first one to say something like that," he remarked cautiously. My parents were uneasy, as if they were unsure if this was a joke or not. The ranger, however, did not smile. Many years have passed since that day. Since then, I've taken a few walks, but nothing strenuous or that could lead to turned around once more. Sometimes I think of Eli and how composed he was, how familiar the trail felt to me as I followed him, and how self-assured he was. I don't act as though I understand what actually transpired. I am aware of what I witnessed, albeit it could have been stress or memory tricks. I am aware of who assisted me, and he knew exactly where I needed to go, regardless of who or what he was. You know how some experiences, no matter how much time goes by, just stay with you. One of those memories that just won't go away is what occurred to me and my daughter Lily on our camping trip last spring. Fade. I am an unmarried father. Lily is now 15 years old, and I have been raising her alone since she was 4 months. We had been organizing this father-daughter camping trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I am employed as a mechanical engineer working for a modest Virginia company. Additionally, we almost ever spent quality time together anymore due to my hectic work and our academic obligations. With just the two of us exploring the paths we had explored when she was younger, the trip was meant to be an opportunity for us to reconnect. The Coleman tent with the patch on it was our old one, and I recall packing it. The side from 3 years ago, when she unintentionally tore it with a marshmallow stick. As we loaded my Ford Explorer that Friday morning in May, everything appeared to be going perfectly, and for once, Lily was genuinely excited rather than engrossed in her phone. Our reserved campsite was situated in a clearing encircled by tall oak trees that deflected sunlight, approximately 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail. These lovely patches of gold. Although we had previously hiked this area, we had never spent the night in a tent. Since our previous visit, Lily had developed significantly. She was now easily keeping up with me, while grumbling about her math instructor, Mr., and talking about our pals, Peterson, who reportedly administered exams that were impossible. The temperature was probably around 70, and there was a slight breeze that smelled of pine needles and wildflowers. The weather was wonderful. We camped at about 300 p.m. Then I gave her instruction on how to correctly stake down the rainfly, something I had been intending to do for a long time to show her. She was genuinely listening and raising insightful queries about why we should set the stakes in a particular direction. When we were done, we shared a bag of trail mix and grilled hot dogs on our tiny camp stove as the sun began to set below the mountain ranges. Regarding I felt like I had my little girl back for the first time in months, despite her constant reminders that she was no longer small. Approximately 6 p.m., we were seated on a fallen log, approximately 50 feet away from when this person suddenly showed up on the trail. We were playing 20 questions, keeping an eye out for wildlife, and enjoying our tent. He really did seem to appear out of nowhere. I mean, we were alone for a moment, and then he was approaching us with this odd, uneven gait from maybe 30 yards away. He was about ordinary height, appeared to be in his 40s, and had his jeans were filthy, as if he had been rolling around in the dirt, and his green flannel shirt was much too warm for the temperature. His hair hung in clumps around his face, black and oily. Additionally, he had a patchy beard that appeared to have gone weeks without being trimmed, but it was his eyes that truly drew my attention. He seemed to be looking through us instead of at us, as if they were hazy and unfocused. It hadn't rained 4 days, so it seemed strange that his boots were covered in fresh-looking mud, and he had a little rucksack that appeared to be almost empty. As he approached, I saw that his breathing was labored, as if he had been jogging or hiking hard for a while. I apologize. His voice was scratchy when he shouted out from approximately 10 feet away. I apologize for troubling you all, but I was wondering if you might have some extra water. Something about the manner I felt uneasy when he stated it. The way his eyes kept flitting over our campsite, making a list of everything we possessed, was more impressive than the request itself, which was entirely acceptable. Lily leaned closer to me out of reflex, and I could feel her becoming stiff next to me. Sweat and an unidentified substance were seen on the man's clothing, perhaps wet or dirty wool earth. His forearms were covered in red scratches that looked like he had been pushing through dense undergrowth, and his fingernails were covered in mud. Well, I don't really know how long I've been hiking. He kept stroking his hair with a filthy hand. Somewhere back there, I suppose I may have gone off course. His movement was clumsy and uneven, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was aiming, but he made a vague gesture toward the trail behind him. Talking to someone who wasn't fully there in the moment made the entire exchange seem unreal. I couldn't just turn the guy away, of course. I was brought up by my father to assist those in need. Because it seemed blatantly cruel to deny someone water in the middle of nowhere, I answered, "Sure, no problem," as I rose from the log and made my way to our tent, where we stored our water supply. Lily remained motionless, clearly uncomfortable as she observed the man. I took a blue Nalgene that was about 3/4 filled, one of our extra water bottles, and gave it to him. The man grabbed it with both hands as if it were the most valuable item in the world, and he began gobbling it up with loud, urgent swallows right away. He appeared unconcerned as water trickled down his chin and onto his shirt. "Everything. Between gulps," he added. "Thank you so much. How much this means to me is beyond your comprehension." The thing that truly disturbed me, though, Is this? As he drank, his gaze continued to wander over our campground, lingering on our tent, our backpacks, and the food cooler. It was more than a passing interest. He seemed to be recording everything we had and learning the layout by heart. After he was done drinking, he gripped the bottle for too long and turned it in his hands as though he could decide to retain it, in an attempt to appear amiable while also obtaining information. I inquired, "Are you camping nearby?" My maternal instincts were going haywire because of this whole circumstance. The man shook his head slowly while staring at me with those glazed eyes. No, I'm just trying to get back to my car," he responded. However, his tone wavered as if he wasn't certain. "It looks different now, but I parked someplace down the mountain, the trails. I don't remember seeing them there." Despite the warm weather, his fingers were freezing as he returned the empty bottle to me. "Out here, you people seem to know what you're doing. Have you been camping for a while?" Even though the inquiry seemed harmless enough, his piercing gaze made me want to cut the talk short. It wasn't typical of Lily to be silent the entire time. Even with strangers, she was generally quite gregarious. However, she sat motionless on that log, observing this man as if he were a ferocious animal that may suddenly run away. "Just got here today," was my purposefully evasive response. "Planning to head out tomorrow morning." I'm not sure why I misrepresented the time we were leaving. Actually, we were going to stay an extra night, but I had a gut feeling that I shouldn't tell him our true schedule. The guy gave me a slow nod, but I could see he was thinking about what I had said, perhaps putting it off for later. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. "It's not safe to stay out here too long. People go missing in these mountains." "That's good. Tomorrow morning." Lily's eyes widened, and she eventually remarked, "Dad, we should probably start getting dinner ready." He said it so casually, as if he were making a remark about the weather, but it hung between us like a menace. For a brief while, the man's demeanor shifted from one of watery confusion to one of acute calculation as his head turned toward her voice, giving us an opportunity to finish this talk. "Pretty daughter, she's got good instincts," he added, and the way he said it made all the alarms in my head go off. "You ought to pay attention to her." He picked up his almost empty backpack and began to move away from our campsite, but he continued to watch us. "Once more, thank you for the water. I might run into you people." After that, he turned and headed back down the route, although not in the same direction as before. The pathway divided into other smaller paths that led to more isolated camping places as he made his way toward the deeper portion of the woodland. As we watched him vanish into the forest, I had the strong desire to gather everything and head off right away. However, it was growing dark, and it would be risky to hike down the mountain with Lily in the dark. Lily added, "Dad, that guy was really weird," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. "Did you see how he kept glancing at our belongings, and how he looked at me while I spoke?" I had witnessed it, and it made me feel quite nauseous. "Yes, dear, I did notice that as well." We spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, cooking our dinner and talking about school and her friends, but I could tell we were both on edge. However, he's gone now, and we're going to be fine. I tried to sound confident, but in all honesty, I was already making backup plans in my mind. I kept looking toward the trail, half expecting to see that guy come out of the shadows, and when it came time to set up for the night, I made sure our tent was securely fastened and placed myself between Lily and the tent opening. Every sound from the forest, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us both jump. As we climbed into our sleeping bags, I assured Lily that I loved her and that everything would be fine, but I don't think either of us really believed it. I had my phone, but there was no service up here, so we were totally alone until dawn. My heart began to race so loudly that I was certain Lily would hear it, but she was still sleeping next to me, taking deep breaths At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, circling our tent, not animal footsteps, but intentional human footsteps, moving slowly and carefully around our campsite. A metallic scraping sound, like something hard being dragged across a rock, was heard just outside our tent, maybe 3 feet from where we were lying. The sound moved in a slow arc around our tent, and I realized with horror that someone was purposefully circling us, dragging something metal along the ground. I held my breath, trying to think of what to do. I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that I might have received a signal, but the screen displayed nothing but no service in the corner. The scraping and footsteps continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The scraping was rhythmic and deliberate, as if whoever was out there wanted us to know they were there. I lay motionless, listening for any sign of activity, but all I could hear were the typical woodland noises: crickets, wind through the trees, and the distant hoot of an owl. The silence was somehow far more unsettling than the sounds had been. The next thing I knew, sunlight was coming through the tent fabric, and Lily was waking me up. "Dad, there's something outside," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to get a glimpse of what was outside, and it broke my heart. I must have fallen asleep at some point. There were gouges in the dirt around our tent, deep scratches that were perhaps an inch deep and ran the length of our campground, forming a perfect circle if someone had marked the ground with a crowbar or something similar. My blood ran cold as I noticed something near the fire pit. Muddy boot prints that resembled the ones I had seen on Lustra's feet the day before, but they were all over our campground, crisscrossing it as if he had been moving freely while we were sleeping. The worst part was discovering what appeared to be a makeshift shelter about 50 yards into the woods, a lean-to made from branches, and at least 20 different prints that were so close to our tent that he could have reached out and touched the fabric. He had likely been out there for a long time, watching us sleep. We packed up our campsite in record time, hardly talking as we crammed everything into our backpacks, and I could see the fear in Lily's eyes as she kept looking toward the makeshift shelter in the woods. Leaves that hadn't been there when we'd arrived. Someone had been camping within sight of us, and we'd had no idea. Even though we were moving faster than ever before, the hike down the mountain seemed to go on forever, and each time we heard a sound behind us, we would both turn around, expecting to see that strange man following us down the trail. I was so relieved to see other people when we finally arrived at the parking area. We tossed our belongings into the Explorer and left as quickly as possible, seeing a couple of day hikers reading their maps, a family loading their car after their own camping trip, and other everyday people going about their daily lives. About an hour into the drive, I felt we needed to report this to someone, so I stopped at a state police station in a tiny town called Millerville. The drive home was quiet as we both processed what had transpired. Sergeant Williams, the middle-aged cop who took our statement, got extremely serious as I described the man we had met and began to ask specific questions about his appearance, his attire, and the precise moment we had seen him. After 10 minutes or so, Williams vanished into a back room and reappeared with a file folder and a somber expression. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I believe you and your daughter met someone we've been searching for. Two hikers, Kevin and Beth Turner, from Pennsylvania, have been reported missing in that area since Saturday." When he showed me their pictures, I was astounded. They appeared to be a typical, content couple, maybe in their 30s, both wearing bright hiking gear and grinning at the camera. They were meant to leave their campground on Sunday morning, but they never did. About 3 miles from where you were staying, we discovered their abandoned campsite yesterday. Their tent was still up, but everything they owned was gone, and we discovered boot prints that didn't match theirs, indications that someone had been watching them from the woods, and proof that someone else had been there before. The officer clarified that in addition to looking for the hikers who had gone missing, they had also been searching for a man who fit the description of our water-seeking stranger, who had apparently been spotted by other campers in the area. Over the previous few weeks, they suspected he was. The good news was that our report provided them with enough information to step up their search efforts, and within a week they had located the person who was living rough in the mountains, possibly suffering from mental illness or drug addiction. William explained that the crowbar scratches around our tent were probably his way of marking territory or sending a message. Lily and I never returned to those mountains, and she still refuses to camp anywhere without cell phone service. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had stayed that second night as we had originally planned. The man, and tragically, evidence of what had happened to the missing hikers. I never got all the details, but I know the man was arrested and the case was closed. But to be honest, I'm just glad we got home safely. I was 28 years old at the time, a Chicago software engineer who had spent months organizing this lone hike up the Appalachian route, and what happened to me last summer still haunts me every time I go past hiking supply stores or look at route maps. It was supposed to be therapeutic, just me, my backpack, and the wilderness stretching ahead. I had been training for weeks, researching trail conditions, and obsessively mapping out shelter locations. The whole thing was supposed to be my escape from the corporate grind and a chance to find some peace in nature. Although I had done many day hikes in the past, this was my first multi-day solo adventure, and I must admit that I was quite eager to prove to myself that I could manage it. The excitement had been building for months, and I felt prepared for whatever the trail might present. Also, I believed. I had been hiking for about 6 hours when I arrived at this small town close to the trail, and I decided to get some supplies and possibly a hot meal before going to my planned shelter for the night. The day began perfectly, with clear skies, moderate temperatures, and a light breeze that made the miles feel effortless. I was finishing my coffee when this older man at the counter, who must have been in his 70s and had a weathered face with deep lines around his eyes, overheard me discussing my hiking plans. He turned slowly around, and the local diner was one of those traditional small-town establishments with checkered tablecloths and a waitress who called everyone hun. I asked him why, of course, but he just shook his head and muttered something about bad things. He looked at me gravely and said something that should have raised suspicions. "Whatever you do, don't sleep at Whisper Ridge Shelter tonight." His voice was low and urgent, as if he was sharing some sort of secret. The waitress who had been listening rolled her eyes and said the old man was being dramatic. She clarified that Whisper Ridge was completely safe, just an old three-sided wooden shelter about 2 miles up the trail, just like dozens of others along the route. "Happened there," he said, before returning to his pie. The entire conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but something in his eyes made my stomach turn a little. I'd already planned my route, and the next shelter was another 8 miles away. I was exhausted, my feet hurt, and he kept saying that I should find somewhere else to sleep, anywhere else. The sensible part of my brain dismissed his warning as small-town folklore, and to be honest, I thought he was just some superstitious local trying to frighten the city boy. The hike to Whisper Ridge took me through some of the most breathtaking forest I had ever seen, with towering oak trees creating a natural cathedral above the trail, and shafts of golden afternoon light filtering through the leaves in a way that made everything appear almost magical. The shelter was rather ordinary, a three-sided wooden building with a corrugated metal roof set in a tiny clearing surrounded by dense trees, and I recall thinking how serene it was, how this was precisely what I'd been hoping for when I booked the trip. I dropped my pack on the wooden sleeping platform and began setting up my gear, feeling fairly satisfied with my decision to disregard the old man's warning. The place had that musty outdoorsy smell that comes from years of hikers passing through, and there was a fire ring out front and a wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. I felt totally at peace with the world as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and I spent the evening doing the usual hiker things, like making a simple dinner on my camp stove writing in my trail journal, and watching the stars come out as darkness descended on the forest. The silence was amazing, broken only by the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, or the occasional hoot of an owl. I crawled into my sleeping bag at around 9 o'clock and took out my headlamp to read for a while. The shelter felt sturdy and secure, and I was already mentally planning my route for tomorrow. I must have fallen asleep at 10:30, book still in my lap, feeling the temperature had dropped nicely. A light breeze was blowing through the open side of the shelter, and I felt more at ease than I had in months. Everything was perfect, almost perfect, if you will, and I should have remembered that the old man's warning wasn't about the shelter itself, but rather about what it occurs there after dark. The first whisper, which arrived around midnight, was so faint that I initially believed it was the wind blowing through the trees, my head playing games as I shifted between sleep and awareness. It was muted, but obviously real, like people having a conversation. And then I heard it again, human voices, definitely somewhere just beyond the shelter's back wall, several individuals speaking in low tones. The voices seemed to be moving slowly around the shelter's perimeter, never getting closer, but never going away either. They didn't want to be overheard. My heart began to race, and I lay motionless, trying to make out words or measure the number of people outside. All my instincts told me that this wasn't normal, yet something about the tone and the secretiveness of the whispering made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself that it was probably just other hikers setting up a late camp. The whispering went on for what seemed like hours, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then growing loud enough for me to know it was still there. I reached for my headlamp, but I didn't turn it on, so I just held it like a weapon while I listened. I could hear at least 2 different voices, possibly 3. The strangest thing was that the voices never seemed to move in any logical pattern, and I was unable to comprehend a single word they were saying. It was as if they were speaking a different language, or perhaps they were simply too far away for the words to be heard clearly. My logical mind kept searching for answers, but my body was reacting to sheer terror. They would be behind the shelter 1 minute, then off to the left, then right, as if the speakers were simply aimlessly wandering through the woods. I kept waiting for footsteps, for the sound of branches breaking, or for the crunch of leaves, but all I could hear were those unsettling whispers that were always floating through the darkness. The whispers increased in frequency and seemed to be approaching the shelter walls as the night went on, and I could hear them best when they were right behind me, with only the thin wooden planks of the back wall between us. And at one point, I swear I heard what sounded like fingers tapping lightly against the wood. The voices would fade away for 10 or 15 minutes, giving me hope that whatever was out there had moved on. But then they would return, always in that same hushed, secretive tone, and then I would hear a faint rhythmic tapping that lasted maybe 30 seconds before stopping, at which point I realized I was holding my breath, fearing that even the sound of my breathing might draw attention to where I was lying. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the whispers abruptly stopped completely, and I must have looked at my watch 100 times, counting down the hours until sunrise and hoping that daylight would end this nightmare. The worst part was not knowing who or what was out there, or why they were circling my shelter like predators stalking prey. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for something to happen, my ears so tuned to the slightest sound that I could hear. My own heartbeat pounding in my head. Minutes passed, then an hour, and it was almost worse than the voices had been, because I had no way of knowing where they were or what they were doing. When still nothing, I began to believe that perhaps they had finally moved on, whomever they were. However, as I was starting to unwind, I heard footsteps, slow, purposeful footsteps moving around the shelter's exterior, and they weren't human, light feet. I could see nothing but darkness, but I felt someone was standing there, watching me. The steps circled the shelter once, twice, then halted right in front of the open entrance, heavy and intentional, as if they wanted me to know they were there. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps stopped, and then the typical forest sounds, crickets, the distant owl's hoot, the soft rustle of leaves came back. However, I didn't sleep for another minute that night. Instead, I lay there, with my headlamp in hand, watching the shelter's entrance and listening for any indication that the whispers, every shadow appeared to shift. Every sound made me jump, and when the first faint light of morning began to peek through the woods, I was more relieved than ever to see the sunrise. I packed my things quickly, skipping breakfast and coffee, because I just wanted to get out of there and back to civilization. I took one last glance around the clearing before leaving the shelter, and I swear I could still feel eyes watching me from somewhere in the shadowy woods. I practically ran down the trail, putting as much distance between myself and Whisper Ridge as possible, because the serene forest from the previous day felt hostile and menacing, as if it were hiding secrets I didn't want to know. When I eventually returned to the same diner where I had stopped the day before, I was tired, suspicious, and probably looked the same waitress was working when she asked me if I was okay, and her face went white when I told her about the footsteps and the whispers. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with the elderly man from the previous day, as if I had seen a ghost. As it turned out, he was her father and assisted in running the establishment. He sat down opposite me, his weathered face grave, and told me what I should have known before I disregarded his warning. That exact shelter had been the scene of the murder of a hiker named Jake Mitchell some 15 years prior, where he had been stabbed several times while sleeping. And the old man looked me in the eye and said, "That's why we try to warn people," adding that since then, locals had been reporting odd voices and sounds near the shelter, especially on nights when single hikers remained there. The killer had never been apprehended. Some locations simply aren't intended for living people anymore. The logical part of me wants to think it was all in my head, but I never went on that hiking trip and haven't returned to any distant route since. I quietly drank my coffee, paid my bill, and drove directly home to Chicago. I know deep down that what I heard that night was real, those footsteps, those whispers, that presence watching me from the darkness, and that it was all related to what happened to Jake Mitchell 15 years ago. Perhaps it was just the stress of sleeping alone in a strange area, or perhaps it was some locals pulling practical jokes. I will never know if it was his spirit warning me, or something more sinister that had been lured to that location by the violence, but I do know that I ought to have heeded the old man's warning. Some counsel, no matter how odd it may seem, is worth taking seriously. The weekend was supposed to be perfect, and I was 17 years old, about to graduate from Pine Ridge High, and I thought I had everything. I still wake up occasionally in the middle of the night, thinking I can hear those whispers just beyond my bedroom wall, and I have to remind myself that I'm hundreds of miles away from Whisper Ridge, but the memory of that night will never leave me. Figured it out. 12 of us packed into 3 cars for our yearly senior camping trip, headed up to Copper Mountain, a vast wilderness area about 2 hours north of town, renowned for its immaculate lakes and hiking trails that seem to go on forever into the forest. I had been coming to this place. My friends called me restless, but I'd always been the type that needed to move, explore, and discover something new. I'd been here with my family since I was a child, so I knew the area better than most. The others were happy to sit around the fire drinking beer, and they'd somehow gotten past the park rangers. Most of the party had settled in for the day when things began to go apart on Saturday afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky, creating these long shadows across the pine trees that made everything look like a postcard. I like to think of myself as daring. I had been sitting with them for maybe an hour, trying to get into the spirit of a relaxing weekend, but my thoughts kept going to Crystal Lake. Some were taking naps in their tents, while others were playing cards on a makeshift table constructed out of a cooler and some boards. My dad had taken me there when I was 14, and I had never forgotten how the water was so clear, straight to the bottom, even in the deepest parts. The trail was well marked, but difficult, winding through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings that required some serious scrambling. It was a hidden gem, about 3 miles up the mountain trail, tucked away behind a ridge where most tourists never bothered to venture. The decision that would change everything came at 4:30, when I told the group that I was going on a hike, possibly to see the sunset from higher up. Most of them hardly looked up from their cards, but my best friend, Jessica, who had shoulder-length auburn hair, gave me this worried look, had these emerald eyes that seemed to look straight through people's underscore, "Are you certain you want to go alone?" I brushed her off, probably a bit too dismissively, and promised her I'd be back before full dark. "It's getting kind of late, and those trails can be tricky in the dark," she said, her voice carrying the protective tone she used when she believed I was being dangerous. With an almost heady sense of confidence, I snatched up my phone, a water bottle, and my dad's old hiking boots, the ones with the characteristic red laces that had carried me on innumerable adventures, and the first mile of the route was just as I remembered. The air was clean and crisp, carrying that unique mountain scent of pine resin and damp earth, and the gentle incline through a corridor of towering pines, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot that muffled every step. I'd always loved this part of the hike because it felt like I was walking through a natural cathedral, with shafts of golden sunlight filtering down through the canopy in these perfect dust-filled beams. I passed several known sights, including the lightning-stricken oak that had been sliced in half, the sleeping giant-like boulder formation, and the tiny brook that bubbled over flawless stones made of glass that had been polished by decades of water flow. I decided to take a selfie to email to Jessica around midway through the second mile, partially to show that I was okay, and partly because the lighting was so wonderful. Everything was just as it should be, calm and familiar. The trail curved around a steep drop-off at that point, offering this amazing vista of the valley below and the mountain peak stretching into the distance. I held my phone up at arm's length, angling it to capture both my face and the breathtaking view behind me. I took maybe 5 or 6 shots, adjusting my position slightly each time to try to get the ideal angle. I sent a little message to Jessica, and the final picture came beautifully, with my black hair catching the light and a real smile on my face against this stunning backdrop of wilderness that looked like it belonged in a nature magazine. "See, utterly," I pushed send, and the message instantly appeared with the tiny blue check marks that indicated it had been delivered and read. I put my phone back in my jacket pocket and carried on. "It's fine up here. The view is amazing." The next part of the trail was where things started to change, though I was unaware of it at the time, as the path became steeper and more winding, snaking back and forth across the mountainside in tight switchbacks that made my calves burn with every step. I was feeling proud of myself for making the climb and excited about getting to the lake before sunset. The forest also started to shift, with the lofty pines giving way to shorter, scrubby trees and rocky outcroppings that protruded at strange angles, and on some of the tougher parts I had to balance myself with my hands, holding onto rocks and roots that had been worn smooth by innumerable hikers. Even the typical forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, and distant water seemed muted and far away, and the silence was different here, more complete somehow, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. I kept checking my phone to see if I would have enough daylight for the return trip, but the screen kept about 20 minutes into this steeper section. I began to get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, the kind that makes you want to turn around and see if someone is watching you. At first, I thought it was just nerves from being alone in the room, but then I noticed that strange no-service message, even though I'd had full bars just minutes earlier. The track had narrowed now, just wide enough for one person, with heavy undergrowth pressing in on both sides, but the feeling continued to grow stronger with each step, and I found myself looking back more often, searching the way behind me for any movement. I tried shaking, but the feeling remained. Like that scene in a horror film where you know something's wrong, but can't quite place it. There was nothing there, just a deserted trail disappearing around the last bend. The oddest thing was how the forest seemed to be responding to my presence. Tiny animals that should have been running away from my footsteps were nowhere to be seen. And even the insects had moved. I started by concentrating on the physical challenge of the climb, counting my steps and breathing steadily, but every few minutes I would catch myself looking back again. The only sounds left were my own breathing and the gentle crunch of my boots on the stony trail. I had been hiking these mountains for years, but I had never encountered anything like this uncanny silence. There was no buzzing, no chirping, nothing. When I stopped to drink from my water bottle, the silence was so total that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. It was as if all the creatures in the forest had suddenly decided to hide, leaving me alone on the mountainside. I stood there for a while, listening carefully, trying to hear anything that could explain the strange atmosphere. The trail curved away behind a group of enormous rocks, making it difficult to see the path I had just taken. I heard a single crack of a branch somewhere on the trail behind me. I stood motionless for a few long seconds, waiting to see if the sound would recur, but there was nothing, only that suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. It was impossible to see very far back. I cried out, "Hello." I thought it was probably just a deer or maybe a squirrel, but I felt, deep inside, that wasn't right. Remember, all the wildlife had disappeared, with a tone that wasn't as strong as I had planned. The lake couldn't be much farther now, and I was eager to get there before the sun went down entirely, so I waited for another minute before deciding to keep going after the words seemed to be sucked up by the trees before they could go very far, and received no answer. The last section of the trail was the most difficult since it was steep, but as I started ascending again, I couldn't get rid of the impression that something was following me, staying just out of sight, matching my pace step for step. I had to put both hands on the rock and basically climb rather than walk, finding footholds in the crevices and pulling myself up section by section as I scrambled up a rocky face that demanded all of my focus. It was exhausting work, and even though the mountain air was cool, sweat was dripping into my eyes. About halfway up this last climb, I took a moment to catch my breath and made the mistake of looking back down the path I'd come from. What I saw at the end of the trail, perhaps 50 yards away, was a figure standing still among the trees. It was too far away and too dark to make out any details, but it made my heart race for reasons unrelated to the physical effort. The figure, partially hidden by the branches, was tall and dressed in dark clothing, and most unnerving of all, it appeared to be motionless, standing motionless like a statue. It was unquestionably human-shaped and watching me. I blinked hard, thinking, maybe I glanced again, but the figure was still there, unaltered, so I yelled out again, louder this time, "Hey, are you okay?" My voice reverberated off the altitude and the exertion. There were rock faces all about me, but the figure below made no move, didn't wave, didn't shout back, didn't even appear to recognize that I had spoken. Panic began to creep up my throat, and I made a quick decision that likely saved my life. I started to descend as quickly as I could, half sliding and half stumbling down the rocky slope, intending to confront whoever was pursuing me, demand answers, and regain control of the situation. However, as I approached the location where I had spotted the figure, I became increasingly horrified to discover that there was no one there. No, I turned around and began running down the trail, my phone clutched in my hand, desperately trying to get a signal so I could call for help. The panic struck me hard at that moment, and I gave up any thoughts of reaching the lake. Footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no indication that anyone had been standing in that spot at all. I was running so fast that I nearly missed the sound of my phone slipping from my sweaty palm and hitting the ground. I heard it bounce once, twice, then slide off the edge of the trail and into the woods. Every shadow seemed to conceal a possible threat, and every rustling branch made me jump and look around wildly. I stopped and looked at the area where it had vanished, knowing that I should go down to get it, but I was too scared to stray from the main path, so I continued running, motivated by a fear I had never felt before. The last thing I can clearly recall is arriving at I thought I was finally getting near to safety after a familiar stretch of trail with the lightning-stricken oak. But then everything went dark, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed with Jessica sitting next to me, her face strewn with tears. People often ask me why I no longer hike, which used to be my favorite activity in the world, especially with my brother Tyler. We would go on hikes every weekend, often spending hours driving to discover new locations that no one else knew about. In August of last year, we chose to take on Mount. The plan was straightforward. Harrington, this enormous peak about 3 hours north of our hometown in Vermont, where Tyler, then 24, had just graduated from college with his fancy business degree, and I, then 26, had a dead-end job at a warehouse and needed a break from the routine that had engulfed our lives. When we loaded up Tyler's beat-up Ford Ranger with our gear on Saturday morning, the weather prediction seemed ideal. Clear skies, mid-70s, and hardly any wind. We had 2 days, 1 night of camping, and enough space away from civilization to temporarily forget our troubles. Mount Harrington wasn't exactly beginner-friendly, but we'd done plenty of difficult hikes before, and Tyler was always the more daring one, always encouraging us to try harder trails and venture farther off the beaten path. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, looking at trail maps and reading reviews online. We complemented each other well, or so I believed until that day. Normally, I was the voice of reason, the one who made sure we had enough water and didn't take any needless risks. By the time we arrived at the path, with the exception of one other vehicle with out-of-state license plates, the parking lot was mostly deserted around noon. Perfect, Tyler said, smiling as he carried his pack, just the way we like it. The initial hours proceeded according to plan. Tyler was in one of his talkative moods, talking about this girl he'd met at a coffee shop and his plans to finally move out of our parents' house, and I was only half listening, mostly concentrating on the rhythm of my boots against the packed dirt and the amazing views that were opening up below us as we followed the main trail up through dense pine forest, pausing occasionally to check the map and take pictures. When we arrived at what the map indicated was Eagle's Rest, a level clearing roughly halfway to the summit, at 3 o'clock, we decided to take a longer break, sharing a bag of trail mix and making plans for the last push, when Tyler noticed something that wasn't on our map. He pointed out what appeared to be a narrow ledge protruding from the cliff face about 50 yards to the east, barely visible through the trees. Tyler's eyes brightened as always when he discovered something new to investigate, and he got up and "Come on," he said, adjusting his pack straps. "Before we go to the campsite, let's take a look." I paused, looking first at my watch and then at the dense clouds that were beginning to form on the horizon. I didn't like the idea of going off the designated trail this late in the day, but we still had a few hours of daylight left, and mountain weather could change quickly. However, Tyler was already heading toward the trees, and I knew from experience that it was useless to argue with him when he got like this. "Fine," I said, grabbing my pack, but just taking a quick glance. "We're not spending up there at night." Tyler went first as usual, clearing branches and yelling back warnings about dangerous rocks. Reaching the ledge was more difficult than it appeared. We had to push through dense underbrush and climb over fallen logs, possibly following an ancient animal route. After about 20 minutes of cautious maneuvering, we finally emerged onto the ledge Tyler had discovered, which was larger than I had anticipated. As we proceeded away from the main trail, the forest seemed to shut in around us, the canopy growing denser and the air cooler. Tyler walked to the edge right away, looking down into the depths while I stayed back, never comfortable with heights like that. It was perhaps 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, with a sheer drop-off on one side that had to be at least 200 feet down. The view was simply amazing, spanning miles across the valley with the river winding through the forest below like a silver ribbon. Tyler kicked at the ashes, which appeared recent enough to still contain some pieces of unburned wood. The ledge itself was covered in loose gravel and dotted with what appeared to be old camping equipment, a few rusted tent stakes, some frayed rope, and the remnants of a fire pit someone had constructed against the back wall. "Somebody's been here recently," he added, squatting to take a closer look at the arrangement. That thought didn't sit well with me. There was a sense of abandonment across the place, as if everyone had hurried away. The way the wind whistled through the rocks behind us, producing these low, hollow sounds that appeared to reverberate from somewhere deep beneath the cliff, had an eerie quality. None of it seemed to disturb Tyler. He was already discussing how wonderful the sunrise would be and organizing how we would pitch our tent on the level area. From this position, as we explored the ledge and watched the sun set, I continued to look at my watch. The temperature was beginning to drop, and the clouds I'd seen earlier were undoubtedly growing denser. Before it became too dark for us to safely traverse, we had to return to the main route and locate our assigned campsite. Tyler, however, was in full exploration mode and was exploring the small little cove that formed at the back of the ledge, where the rock face curled inward. Back there, he had discovered a little fracture in the granite that appeared to be deeper than anticipated. "Hey, look at this out," he called, immediately removing the torch from his phone. "I think this might be a cave or something." I approached grudgingly because I wasn't excited about the prospect of exploring a cave without the right tools. A person could hardly fit through the opening, and the glow from Tyler's phone vanished into total darkness, following only a few feet. As we stood there, the wind grew stronger, and I believe the sound emanating from that crack changed. It changed from the hollow whistling we had been hearing to a quieter, longer-lasting sound that sounded almost like moaning. Tyler stepped back from the doorway, his phone light flickering a little, so he must have heard it too, he said. Probably just the wind hitting the rock at a weird angle, but his voice was not as confident as usual. Tyler wanted to stay and do a little more exploring, so I recommended we return to the main route. Long shadows that seemed to move and shift in ways that made my skin crawl were cast across the cliff by the sun, which was now dangerously low. That was the first time we both heard it clearly. Something that most certainly wasn't wind. It was far away and muted, but definitely human. In the shadows beneath the cliff, someone was yelling. Both of us hurried to the brink. I clasped my hands around my mouth and said, "Hello, can you hear us? Are you hurt?" As Tyler shone his phone light into the emptiness, the screaming abruptly stopped, as if someone had pressed the mute button. For what seemed like an eternity, we waited in utter quiet, listening for any answer. Then it began again, but it sounded different, more frantic, more desperate. It was clear that there were several voices, perhaps 3 or 4 persons yelling at once. Tyler's light was unable to see anything in the darkness, but it appeared that the sound was coming from right below us. I took my own phone and merged its beam with his, but even with both of us, we were unable to see any information about what was underneath the ledge. The yelling persisted in waves, occasionally becoming barely audible, and at other times loud enough that I was certain other hikers miles away could hear it. Murmurs. Tyler started calling 911 right away, but we obviously didn't have mobile coverage up there. We were encircled by too much rock and forest, and too far from any towers. I also tried using my phone. I walked around the cliff in hopes of finding even one bar, but I was unsuccessful. The screaming was becoming more strong now, and it was starting to feel almost rhythmic, which made me shiver. It no longer sounded like someone calling for assistance. It had a completely different sound. Tyler had already started packing up his equipment, his face going white in the last of the sun. His voice was taut with desperation as he stated, "We need to get back to the trail and find a ranger station. Who knows how long these folks have been stuck down there." We walked back through the woodland more quickly than we had ever done. As we pushed into the underbrush, branches tore at our clothing. The shrieking went on behind us, until we could no longer hear it, with our headlamps blazing through the encroaching darkness. As we sped dangerously past roots and rocks, we virtually sprinted down the main track. Desperate for any signal, Tyler continued to check his phone every few minutes. We eventually found two bars around a mile from the trailhead. Tyler dialed 911 right away, and I took out the trail map to try to pinpoint our precise location to the dispatcher. The entire exchange seemed unreal, describing how we required search and rescue crews right away after hearing many people yelling from somewhere below a cliff. We couldn't see them, but they sounded trapped. Despite being professional, the dispatcher was obviously dubious because she repeatedly asked us to clarify that we hadn't actually seen anyone. As best we could, we provided them with the coordinates, explaining the off-trail ledge and where the screaming was coming from. Although they acknowledged that night rescue efforts in that area were exceedingly risky and infrequently effective, they pledged to deploy crews at first light. That night, neither of us was able to sleep, so we slept in our car at the trailhead. Tyler continued to discuss how we ought to have attempted to rappel down, in some way, that we would desert those who were depending on us, in an attempt to persuade myself that it had indeed been human voices and not some strange acoustic phenomenon. I continued playing the sound over in my mind. A helicopter circled the area for hours after 3 search and rescue vehicles arrived. Before dawn, using ropes and other tools, the ground crew combed every inch of the cliff face beneath that ledge all day, specialized tools to reach places that didn't seem reachable. One of the rangers came grimly toward our automobile that day. They had not discovered anything. There were no bodies, no persons, and no signs that anyone had ever been stranded there. However, his next statement made my stomach flip. He whispered to us, "You're not the first ones who report screaming from that exact spot, approximately once a year. Around nightfall, always, the same description every time. Nothing has ever been discovered by us. However, we continue to search, because, well, what else are you able to do?" There hasn't been any hiking since Tyler and I drove home in total silence. I still occasionally wake up to the sound of those shouts, wondering if we actually left someone that night or if we had stumbled across something far more serious than a straightforward rescue. I was trekking by myself for a weekend close to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park's boundary. Even though I didn't normally do it alone, I needed time to reflect and breathe after ending a long-term relationship. I had carefully packed my equipment, double-checked the weather, and planned this route several weeks in advance. Everything appeared to be all right until it wasn't. Thick clouds rolled in more quickly than I anticipated about mid-afternoon. It was dark on the trail within minutes. Thunder began rolling so close that it sounded like the mountain itself was exploding as the rain came in sideways. The trail I was on had been marked on an old-fashioned printed map, the type you get at petrol stations, and I had picked it specifically because it was less crowded than the main thoroughfares I had spent the entire day alone. I was soaked and in a panic by the time the lightning was close enough to cause my pack to vibrate. I took out the map in search of a shortcut or some sort of cover. At that point, I saw a small, somewhat faded out notation in the page's fold that read emergency shelter. It's merely a dot in the woods with no mileage or marker. I didn't care that the detour may take 15 or 20 minutes, or possibly longer in the muck. I started running after taking the turn. I had the impression that I was pursuing a ghost. The trail wound through thick trees and was narrow and overgrown. My jacket was scratched by low branches. It all smelled of earth and damp leaves. I almost slipped again on the slippery rock, but then I noticed it. A tiny, rectangular building that was partially buried in the hill, if the mountain had attempted to reclaim it. A rusting metal door with flaking paint, concrete walls, and a shattered window with plywood patches. It appeared deserted and unwelcoming, but the storm was intensifying and I was completely saturated. I opened the door with a push They stepped inside it without locking it. It appeared vacant at first, a shelf holding an old first aid kit, a bench built into one wall, a concrete floor, and a few folded wool blankets. Inside, the wet air had a mildewy odor. Then, though, I became aware of several issues. Near the bench was an open granola bar wrapper that looked as though it had just been eaten. It wasn't even wet, a plastic bottle, dust-free, half full of water. Additionally, a bright red, tattered fleece jacket with one sleeve nearly torn off was tucked away in the corner behind the bench. I recall standing there dripping, staring at that ripped crimson sleeve, thinking, if this place hasn't been on maps for years, why does it look like someone was just here? Wasn't just torn. It seems to have been caught on something sharp or yanked. The collar also had faint dirt stains, or perhaps something darker. I felt as though I had disrupted something that wasn't supposed to be seen when I took it up. I made an effort to convince myself that someone had most likely simply rushed out. It didn't feel organized, but it might have been a hiker or a ranger who got lost. The clothing, the rubbish, the quiet, I had the impression that I had entered a story that I was not supposed to read. I set up in the room's driest area in an attempt to divert my attention. I took out a protein bar, put on a jacket and an extra pair of leggings, and spread out my emergency blanket. Due to habit, I checked my phone even though I had no service inside the shelter. Nothing. I recall thinking about how far I had strayed from the main trail as I sat there chewing and listened to the rain beating on the roof. I got more conscious of every sound the longer I sat in that concrete box. Drops, a moan from the ancient ceiling, and wind creeping through crevices. As the wind increased, everything began to merge together. Behind my ears, into this low humming pressure, I stood, up to take a closer look around the room. The most of it was naked, and it was only about 12 by 12 feet. However, I saw something dim on the wall behind the shelf, holding the first aid kit. I initially believed it to be graffiti or water damage, but as I drew nearer, I could see the phrases were sharply etched into the pavement. It was a single line, not a complete statement. Don't let anyone else in if they arrive. My inhalation caught, and I retreated a step. The letters' edges were jagged and uneven, as if they had been hastily carved with a rock or a knife. I went back and read it a third time. My mind tried to think of something to explain it. It didn't feel amusing. Perhaps it was an old joke, a holdover from some strange camping trip. It didn't seem new at all, like the person who wrote it didn't want it to be visible. Unless you were really looking, the message was tucked away just far enough under the shelf to be inconspicuous. Then I heard it. The metal door was knocked on 3 slow, purposeful times. It was controlled, not pounding, like if someone knew exactly where they were and wanted me to know too. I remained motionless. I simply sat motionless on the floor, observing the door. The noise has not recurred. There was no voice next. No shuffling of feet. No rattling handle. There was stillness after those 3 knocks. I recall half expecting to see a shadow move beneath the gap as I stared at the seam between the door and the frame. Nothing arrived. Nevertheless, I was unable to approach it. Without moving an inch, I sat there with my heart thumping against my ribs and the impression that the walls had shrunk. I scuttled across the floor and switched off my flashlight after what seemed like 10 minutes had passed. The room was immediately engulfed in darkness. I didn't even take the chance of turning on my phone. I simply placed my back against the wall and remained there, taking as little breath as possible. I'm not sure how much time went by in that manner, perhaps 3 hours. I once fell asleep unintentionally, but every little I woke up again when I heard a brook or a blast of wind outside. I never heard more footsteps. The door was not attempted, although the feeling that something or someone was simply standing there persisted. When daybreak eventually arrived, I was unable to think coherently and was cold and rigid. However, as soon as the light became sufficiently bright I took my bag, stuffed everything inside, and walked out between the gaps in the door frame. Without turning around, in the daylight, the track was simpler to follow, so I ultimately turned around and headed back toward a bigger familiar route. A few hours later, I went by a ranger station and inquired with one of the employees if they were aware of the emergency shelter located beyond the ridge. After pausing, the man gently shook his head. Utilized, he said. To be one up there, however. It was decommissioned almost 15 years ago. The roof was meant to be dangerous. The location was sealed. Is it still standing, you say? I was at a loss for words. Thus I simply informed him that I accidentally discovered it and used it during the storm. I didn't bring up the food wrappers or the jacket, or the text displayed on the wall. I certainly didn't bring up the knock either. I've never returned to that section of the park. I continue to hike, but never by myself or without dated maps. Whatever took place, I don't believe I was meant to notice the warning that was left in that shelter, but someone did. Someone was there, and they didn't enter for reasons I'll never comprehend.